All right, so I am giving you what is probably going to be the last kind of full or real lecture this quarter. And that's because in the weeks that come after our last kind of 2 weeks of the quarter, you all are going to be the ones doing the presenting to your classmates. And I'm really excited to see what you come up with. I would encourage you to take this week, and especially what I'm walking you through now, as kind of an example of the kinds of ways that you might talk about or present your own analysis or discussion of, whether it's a hip hop music video or a film or something like that. Take the last couple weeks and this week as kind of an example. So part of what I've tried to do in this class is to give us kind of a firm foundation of how we can think about the idea of the streets as, a socio-cultural entity, meaning something that impacts our social relations as well as our cultural beliefs about one another, that was kind of the product of housing policy, but through marketing campaigns, through music and film and television and literature and writing, it has become much more than just kind of the creation of these segregated spaces where Black people live, right? It becomes this kind of contested territory where people are fighting over the meaning of, of the city, of Blackness, of Black space, of belonging. And we've kind of looked at the different ways, those different competing narratives, whether they come from politicians like Ronald Reagan or whether they come from Ta-Nehisi Coates talking about West Baltimore. And so we've walked through a lot of that, and what you'll be doing the last couple weeks is providing your own view of where do you see these kind of conversations happening, whether it's, you're going to pick a music video that you think really reflects the way a Black artist is challenging the idea of, the limitations placed on Blackness in these spaces, or whether it's a movie or a television show episode, whatever it might be. So I'm excited to see what you all come up with. What we're going to talk about now is hip-hop. And I know I gave you last week for your exam, you watched this debate. And I thought it would be a good way to start because hip-hop, and I'm using that broadly, whether we're talking about rap, hip-hop, R&B, some stuff that borders on R&B but still falls into hip-hop. But it's a contentious topic, and there's lots of debate, and there's lots of argument about, what it should and should not do, and who should be producing it, who should be consuming it. So what we're going to focus on, and what I think some of that debate frames is, how do we understand hip-hop as an art form? What is its relationship to Black space, Black culture, and what are the ways, or in which this as a genre gets kind of critiqued or dismissed in contrast to other genres, right? So we've looked at literature, we've looked at film, and I think it's much easier for people to say, oh, those are art forms, right? But because of maybe the mass commercialization of hip-hop, or because of some of the themes and topics, and we'll get to some of the critiques, it isn't seen or often, perceived in the same way, especially if you're talking post-1990s, right? We looked at early 90s and what you saw some of the relationship between hip-hop and those hood genre films, but that's about the same time you see a turn in how hip-hop is consumed and perceived, and I'll talk about that. So this lecture, I know I'm tying it to that reading you did. I gave you a small section of Michael Eric Dyson's book, Know What I Mean, and I'll talk just a little bit about that in here. But really in this lecture, I want to give you a brief history of hip-hop and how it connects so directly to everything we've been learning about the history of geographic segregation and race. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of this debate and how the author I had you read for this week gives us, I think, a good framing for examining hip-hop ourselves. And then I'll briefly tell you about the couple of music videos I assigned you to watch. And then I'm excited to see the ones you all come up with. So let's dig into a little bit of this history. It would be a gross understatement to say that hip-hop is connected to the streets. So there's been lots of authors and scholars who've talked about this, and one of them, Cheryl Keyes, I think does a good job when she explains that the streets nurture, shape, and embody the hip-hop music aesthetic, creating a distinct form from other genres of Black popular music that evolved after World War II. So we can talk about different forms of Black music. You know, you could talk about soul, you could talk about, well, to be honest, most forms of contemporary music have their roots in Black art in and of itself, right? So really the question posed here, and what keys that quote I just read gets to, is what is unique about hip-hop in particular? And I would argue that it's one, its connection to Black youth and Black youth experiences in and of the streets, right? So it was emerged and became popular in the mid-1970s, and it literally took place in the streets, right, at local block parties. And the conditions that produced the genre, right, that could produce kind of these particularly Black youth, but also brown youth, Latinx youth, having the time and energy and putting the focus into these block parties is a direct result of a lot of these government policies we've been studying this semester, right? So particularly the ones taking place in the South Bronx. So you all, I'm sure, being in New York, know this history, or at least know the contentious debate around it. But you can't talk about hip hop without talking about the Cross Bronx Expressway. So that was built under the direction of Robert Moses in 1953. But what happened, much like we've talked about with other quote-unquote urban renewal projects and things like that, is that creating the Cross Bronx Expressway, displaced existing communities of color, mostly, you know, African American, Puerto Rican, and Jewish. Some kind of intermixing going on there. But it displaced these communities. And the rationale, though, for building this expressway, right, was that it would provide a direct route between, you know, again, these increasingly wealthy cosmopolitan space of Manhattan and the suburbs of New Jersey and Queens, which we know from our studies were spaces that were being built up with the aid of government housing loans, right? And built specifically for kind of white middle-class people. So it's interesting to think that the Cross Bronx Expressway essentially becomes a mode of transfer from the idyllic paradise of the white suburbs to the cosmopolitan white space of Manhattan without actually having to pass through and be among the, you know, predominantly Black and brown spaces of the South Bronx. So it's interesting to think of like what that project was doing to avoid and to shape certain spaces. But by creating it, again, it displaced this neighborhood, and there were a lot of economic and social implications as well, right? So there were environmental and sound pollutions that were caused by the project. There's the physical disruption of the city space, and it effectively destroyed the neighborhood in the name of, you know, so-called progress and urban renewal, which we've already critiqued that. Where there was once this racially kind of diverse neighborhood in the South Bronx with decent apartments and single-family homes, what was left afterwards was an increased number of public housing projects, right? So again, creating these projects, corralling Black and brown people into them. And these are mostly towers, right? That were designed, again, to confine poor people of color into these manageable spaces so they wouldn't interfere with the business development that was part of that, you know, so-called urban renewal. Unsurprisingly, most of the white residents who formerly inhabited that neighborhood moved to the suburbs, right? So who was left? The Black and brown people who couldn't move and have access to white suburbia. So in addition to further segregating the space and funneling, you know, people of color into these projects, the construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway had a really negative impact on the local economy. And I won't get into too much of it, but just know that hundreds of thousands of like manufacturing jobs were lost. The, you know, per capita income dropped drastically to half the city's average. So people living in this space, again, they're being pushed into public projects, housing projects. They're losing their jobs. Their income is half of everybody else's in the city. And then they're falling prey to slumlords, like some of what was described when we read Ann Petrie's The Street. And a lot of slumlords took over the remaining kind of private buildings. So if you're not in the projects, you're in a private apartment building owned by someone. Slumlords took over these, and they didn't take care of them. You know what a slumlord is. But a lot of them actually turned to arson and insurance fraud as a means to kind of recoup their money. And now that they saw what was happening with the depleted jobs and the economy, the local economy there. So it's interesting. I'm going to circle back to this because a lot of times the narrative around the South Bronx, especially then, was like, well, these people didn't take care of their community, they let it burn, blah, 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 blah. But in reality, it was these slumlords that were burning their own buildings so they could get the insurance money, leaving the actual community, the people there, without homes. And again, they're already without jobs and suffering all these other losses. But despite the fact that it was the slumlords doing this, that those fires that were set, which again weren't kind of, the fires of, protest or things like that. These are fires set by slumlords for the sake of just making money, were used as a justification to further kind of divest from these communities. So what happens, and I'll circle back to the bottom line, but what happened, for example, you remember Daniel Patrick Moynihan, we talked about him and his, how his theories led to the specific way that black people, in particular black women as the welfare queen, but how they were racialized and perceived in these spaces in negative ways. Well, he played a prominent role when he was working for Nixon, President Richard Nixon, and he wrote this memo to him basically saying, actually I'll read the quote, "People in the South Bronx don't want housing or they wouldn't burn it," right? So he goes on to kind of justify and say, like, all these fires are the fault of the people living there. They don't want public help or assistance. That's why everything's burning. So again, they're blamed, even though it's the private landowners that are doing this. So Nixon responded enthusiastically to what Moynihan suggested, and what he suggested, we talked about this before, became known as, benign neglect, right? Or what he calls the quote-unquote benign neglect of race issues. So he told Nixon, essentially, you should just turn your attention other way, let their community, kind of burn to the ground and deal with it themselves. Nixon replied, "I agree," with an exclamation mark. He was very excited about this. So these people were left essentially without any social services or help in the midst of all of this great economic loss and the physical and economic and social destruction of their community was kind of compounded by the fact that the government decided to divest all of the social services that would be needed to support these folks. So educational funding, housing funding, the only kind of quote unquote, publicly funded service, which I use that loosely, was increasing money for policing, right? And so this, again, there's a correlation here between what's happening and the increased mass incarceration of black and brown youth, right? So what happens in this vacuum of a lot of youth who did not have, no longer had jobs or economic kind of means, the youth unemployment increased to 60% after the Cross Bronx Expressway was constructed, and after, again, the government decides to not provide social services or aid or anything. So what happens? You have a culture of youth whose community has been destroyed by the people in power, and so they find different means of, again, surviving, adapting, finding life. And some of that is through local political activism, right? So the Black Panther Party was active still. The Young Lords were still active. There were newly emerging gangs as well, and I want to make sure you all, we don't have time in this course, but I'd urge you to kind of study the distinction between kind of what we call gangs, right? In and of itself, that's a whole nother can of worms that we could open up. But even if you're going to use that term, there's a distinction that's interesting about the kind of unique ways that gangs have evolved or operated at the time. A lot of these were, again, a response to community need where people were finding ways to survive, but also coming together to, find power in a group in certain ways. And it's so complex because I'm not here to tell you like, oh, gangs are actually, good and there's no negative things that happen from that. You're not naive. But it's also more complicated historically than people assume it to be, which I'll touch on that a little bit in a second, but I'm not going to deep dive simply because of time. But I'd encourage you to do some research because it's a very interesting history. But all that to say, these are some of the things that emerged in response to kind of the decimation of this community, right? But again, we've talked about it. It's not all what happens to Black people. Black people resist and rebuild in many ways. And one of the ways was Black youth in particular responded by creating this new cultural, art form or this music through hip hop. So you have hip hop pioneers, which I'm sure you all maybe have heard this story or familiar with, like Africa Bambaataa, and DJ Kool Herc. I do want to make a note that, I'm going to talk about those two in particular because, that's the kind of narrative of the origin of hip hop. But a lot of early pioneers were not men. It is very male centric when we kind of talk about this narrative, but MC Lyte, Queen Latifah, Roxanne Shante, Monet, there's so many people that are, particularly women who are part of this, but don't fit into this kind of like historical narrative. So I want to make sure I at least let you know that they were pioneers, and if you're interested, worth checking out some of their music as well, maybe for your final project even. So a little bit of the kind of the narrative or the origin story as we talk about it. This all traces back to most people, I guess, tend to agree, scholars, historians, that it can be traced back to a party. Hip hop can be traced back to a party that DJ Kool Herc hosted on August 11th of 1973. So we're going back, right? So he was only 18 years old, and he used to play kind of high school parties, and his style of music, and this is significant because when you think about Black space, particularly, I don't have to tell you all this, but in New York, you have to think about kind of, transnational influences. So DJ Kool Herc was influenced by the music of his home country, Jamaica, right? So he moved to Bronx from Kingston in 1967, and he brought with him a practice of toasting or speaking over instrumental records, which are often like the B-side of the record. And that's how he started DJing, and that practice of quote-unquote toasting or speaking over that instrumental track evolved into kind of, rapping over musical tracks that were already well known, and that's what becomes kind of the birth of hip-hop. Now, DJ Herc himself didn't really rap, but he established this practice, and that paved the way for other kind of MCs to take up the mantle, right? So his parties became, popular places for breakdancers, which we'll talk about that as an element of hip hop, right? Or you should know these as elements of hip hop. And so he starts doing these parties, these, block parties again in the streets. And this becomes the birth of hip hop, right? And so it's kind of a beautiful thing to think about it as a history that is, on one hand, the product of this kind of, extreme segregation and like the decimation of Black and brown communities, but also this beautiful product of like Black, transnationalism, and you have the Jamaican influence meeting the Black U.S. context, and the youth kind of culture creating something new from that. And that's where you get the emergence of hip hop. So I won't get into it too much, but just know that, there was this famous party that he hosted. And again, if you know these parties, maybe even now people do them. His sister was trying to, they're trying to make some money. So people pay a cover, they rented out a room, and this is what happens. Interesting to know that even the party takes place in, these are in these public housing apartments often, right? So they'll use the rec room or things like that. And they have the flyers, and people come, and then they, start doing, hyping up the crowd and the breaks right on these instrumental tracks, and that becomes the emergence of hip hop. So eventually, the next summer after that first kind of, block party, or that first party that he held, he's doing this outside, and they were, again, literally in the streets. They would siphon electricity from the city streetlights to set up their sound systems. So I really can't express just how much hip hop is the genre of the streets. When we talk about geographic segregation, this is a musical art form that came directly out of and in response to these segregationist policies, the divestment from Black communities as spaces that were deemed unworthy of attention or financial support. And what Black youth did in response to that is they created a way to express themselves, to find joy and life amidst that. And that should remind you a little bit of Moonlight and that idea of, yes, it doesn't take away the complexities of the streets, but it shows that Black people are complex and find ways to thrive and build community, within them. I'm not going to get into Bambaataa. I'm not going to get into that too much just for sake of time, but I wanted to get to you the idea of the streets as, hip hop as a genre tied, very specifically to the streets. I think for sake of time, I will move on to the readings because I didn't want this lecture to be super, super long because it is Thanksgiving, holiday week, and you have the videos and other things to get through. So let me move on to the essay. So I had you watch that debate, and what I will tie to is say, DJ Herc's The Emergence and Afrika Bambaataa was an important figure as well, and saw and framed hip-hop in a lot of ways. He really, in many ways, in his writing and speaking, kind of theorized what hip-hop is and, articulated it. And he talked about it as, survival economics and keeping our people moving on, right? But a lot of it, he talked about being a mode of self-expression and critical consciousness. And a lot of people, when they talk about hip-hop's golden era, they're talking about what you see in the 70s, 80s, somewhat in the 90s, right? But what you see those scholars and figures in that debate talking about is kind of this break or perceived break of what happens after that golden era in the 1990s when the genre becomes more highly commercialized, right? So, a lot of the people in the video suggested, and, there's some truth to this, but you obviously don't have to agree with them, but it's more complex as well. So I will say, it's a both and, but that kind of the commercialization of hip-hop in the early 90s, and particularly kind of the rise of West Coast gangster rap, people like Snoop Dogg, to them signifies a turn from the genre's primary focus on questions of Black life and well-being to kind of a neoliberal commercialization of hip-hop. And what I mean by that is a focus on just the economic value and production and the individual and the individualism. So you see a lot of like, I'm going to make my money, I'm going to do this, and people consuming it as a product as opposed to it being, and this is again from this view, this perspective about community and self-expression and survival, right? It becomes about commercialization and profit. That's really what I'm getting at when I say that. So that's the critique of it, right? And I think it was in that clip that Trisha Rose said that the extraordinary commercial penetration of hip-hop turned a Black cultural form designed not only to liberate, but to create critical consciousness into the cultural arm of predatory capitalism, right? That's a strong critique. And there's some validity in that critique, right? I mean, you all can look at any hip-hop video or debate today, and even when you talk to people, whether it's, people who listen to hip-hop in the 90s and even the 2000s, myself included, compared to today, we'll have our critiques of it, right? Or people who listen to the 80s hip-hop will have a different critique of like, oh, this isn't the real thing, right? So even in that, there's this idea of like, what is the pure or true idea of hip-hop? But I think that there's kind of two separate things here. And I want to dig into these critiques, and this is where I'm going to point you to the reading. So there's the critique that I think is valid, and I encourage you to really consider, which is what happens when an art form like hip-hop becomes all about profit and, how much money it can make. What does that do to the artist? What does that do to the art form? And what happens when the primary people consuming it are not the people it was created by or for, right? I think that's a valid critique, and I think that's what Trisha Rose is really getting at, right? That a lot of this whole genre has become all about profit rather than, again, a genre tied to Black life and experience and expression in, particularly in the streets, right? So that makes sense. But I think what is adjacent here is the kind of way that hip-hop overall is condemned as like, well, this is just all about money and sex and blah, 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 and there's no real, substance to this as a genre. That's a very different criticism. And so what I will say is that that's a very different criticism, right? And so what Michael Eric Dyson, and why I assigned this to you, is that he really gives us a way to frame or address that. Like, how might we look at hip hop through another lens and not just kind of condemning it as like, well, maybe it had some good origins back in the 70s and 80s, but not anymore. What Dyson does is he encourages us to focus on hip hop, again, reframe it, much like Michael Gillespie did when he talked about film blackness, as an art form and not as, purely sociological commentary, right? So, I'll read you this quote because I think it's a good way that he kind of addresses this, where he says, "Hip-hop is neither sociological commentary nor political criticism, but an art form that traffics in hyperbole, parody, kitsch, drama, dramatic license, double entendres, signification, and other literary and artistic conventions to get its point across." So one thing that this makes me think of to help explain this quote is, if you're familiar with Kendrick Lamar's Backseat Freestyle, when there was an interview and it like disappeared online where he was talking about how people were like over analyzing and trying to understand it and like say, well, is he objectifying women on purpose when he's so conscious in all these other ways, or they were trying to figure it out. And it points to what Dyson is getting at here. For him, and that entire album, again, is it's a concept album, so you have to take it in that context, but it's his persona as a teenager hopping in the backseat with his friends, and they're trafficking in hyperbole, right? They're talking about their dreams, and again, signification, because Martin Luther King Jr. has a dream, and then they talk about their dreams, and again, it's meant to be funny, and it's meant to be, there's meant to be, like, you have to be in the know to understand what's going on there. And yeah, they're talking about women and cars and blah, 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 but as he explained in the interview, it was really just an expression of what it's like to be a teenager hopping in the back of your car with your friends, talking a bunch of ish about what you dream or what you want out of life. And it's meant to just capture that feeling of what it is to be that age and to just have these silly, hyperbolic dreams, right? So that's what Michael Eric Dyson is getting at is, yes, when we'll get into some of the fair critiques of it in just a second, but you can't take hip hop alone and say it's only worthy or it's only important if it's, gives us a strict kind of commentary on society or politics. It does that often, whether it's trying to or not, because that's the nature of producing art. But we have to learn to understand it as an art form, even if it's an art form that takes, uses crude language or images or things. We still have to understand and give it enough value to analyze it through that lens. So if that's part of why I assigned you this reading, is because it reframes hip-hop to say, just like you treat any other art form, you need to treat hip-hop that way. And that's the argument he's making. So I'm going to put up here one other quote by him and by Imani Perry, because I think they really frame how we might think about hip-hop, especially as you are presenting your videos and in relationship to the street. And it circles back to this question of, what we saw happen with the hood genre films was people like John Singleton writing, to and from his experience growing up in South Central LA, but it gets consumed by these white mainstream audiences, and for many people, they saw it as, oh yeah, just like I thought, it's a bunch of gangsters and crackheads and this and that and the other. And that happens with hip-hop all the time, right? I mean, if you've traveled or you do travel abroad, what you see in hip-hop or NBA games informs a lot of what people think about black people, and they will assume that that is what blackness is. And, it's not that it's not that, but it's that and so many things all at once. And that also, what Dyson is pointing us, is that that isn't a negative thing all the time, right? It's not a good blackness or bad blackness. It's a complexity and a humanity. And that's what Dyson is ultimately arguing for. So, it's true that hip-hop produced in the 1990s and afterwards did see greater emphasis on commercial success. And that, there were changes to the genre because of it, right? But the genre remains a complex expression of the streets in a lot of ways, right? So Imani Perry speaks to this, I think, really, really well when she talks about the difference between West Coast gangster rap, in which, you know, the person rapping kind of, as she calls it, mimicked a stereotype, thus becoming a survivalist hero. So you can think about this, all these people talking about, like, I was out there on, you know, Central and this is what happened. And again, they're giving you a narrative of life in that racialized space, and a narrative of the life in a West Coast gangster, right? And she calls that, they kind of give these narratives of survivalist heroes, right? And then East Coast, you saw a lot more of what is called cultural nationalist hip hop, right? Which emphasize, you know, Afrocentrism, Black beauty, Black excellence. These are kind of subgenres, but where the latter, right, might be seen very easy as like conscious hip hop, and yeah, of course that challenges white supremacy and it's a positive thing. She makes the argument that so does, like, West Coast gangster rap also challenges white supremacy, right? But because it's less legible to the mainstream, it's often seen as a lesser art form. But what she explains, and I think it does a good job, is that, the violent imagery and language of gangster rap serves a different purpose for a different audience, right? So I'm going to read this quote where she says, for a mainstream audience, rap, like West Coast gangster rap, may indulge voyeuristic fantasies of Black sociopathy and otherness, right? So it might, to them, to a white consumer unfamiliar, it might just say like, oh, the hood is everything I thought it was, right? But for an oppressed community, right, and particularly Black people familiar with those spaces, these images might engage fantasies of, you know, masculine power and people who feel powerless. And this, I know you didn't read this part of it, but Ta-Nehisi Coates gets in this a little bit in what you read and more so in the book, that a lot of this is like a way to embody a sense of power within your space when you are disempowered in the rest of the world. And that's, you know, one way that we might read that narrative, that voice of that West Coast, you know, hip hop as saying, I am embodying a power and telling you that I have value, I own this, I have that. However materialistic, you know, we'll have our critiques of that, but it's a way of declaring a sense of value in the face of a world that deems you unvaluable, or as Coates would say it, in the face of a world that might snatch your body away at any moment. And so it's interesting, and I think worth thinking about it in that lens, right? But again, I want to acknowledge that it does reinforce a lot of problematic things, right? But Dyson points out to us, I'll circle back to that, right, that that's not a reason to throw away the genre. And just a little bit about Dyson. So he's kind of what's often called a public intellectual. So, you know, he was a former gang member from Detroit, I believe, and now he's a minister, right? So he's lived a life. And he's written all kinds of books, including, if you know, the one on Jay-Z. He's written this book that you're reading. He's, you know, friends with all these rappers. He's lived the life, just like John Singleton, you know, just like your favorite rappers. He's lived this life, but he's coming at it to theorize and explain it in ways that often, you know, as a genre, it doesn't get that kind of theoretical attention or academic attention. So that's a little bit about Dyson. But this is why I think he offers a unique perspective, because he knows not only the genre, but the life and the people, right? He is one of them. And so he, you know, even though hip hop might be full of, you know, materialism and stereotypes and, you know, misogyny and things like that, Dyson really reframes this by saying, are those things unique to hip-hop? And why is it that hip-hop is held to a higher standard than other art forms, right? So literature, art, and music from all races and cultures have similar problems, right? But somehow it's this work that's produced by Black youth that's dismissed and critiqued more than anything else, right? And, you know, much of the criticism directed at hip-hop really fails to acknowledge its complexity as an art form, or the fact that Black life itself is nuanced, right? Just like we saw in Moonlight, Juan was a drug-dealing gangster, but he was also a sweet and gentle mentor that helped a young gay boy find his place in the world, right? Like, it's not an either or. The world is complex, and that's part of what Dyson is pointing us to. So, you know, the problematic aspects of hip-hop, such as, you know, again, the misogyny or Black essentialism, which by that we mean often framing Blackness as like this singular thing, like, are there something essential about Blackness instead of it being the product of, you know, history, culture, things like that. the violence, the materialism, homophobia, right? Like we can't ignore those at all. But these kind of problematic aspects of hip hop are, in my mind, the problematic aspects of our society as a whole, right? So the same society that produced the public housing policies that have segregated Black people and disempowered them and put them in these spaces also produces misogyny, homophobia, and all these other things. And you see them reflected in Black space just as much as you do in white and other spaces. So it's not unique to Black people. It's still worth criticizing, but when we criticize, again, the art form and the product of Black youth more so than others, then we have to ask ourselves why. And again, I know that for you all, I'm probably not, it doesn't take that much to convince you of this. But I think that in general, the world doesn't give enough kind of artistic attention. Although recently we did see Kendrick Lamar win a Pulitzer Prize, which is huge. But it's worth, I think, reframing the debate a little bit. So I won't read the Dyson quote to you, but really what I want to point out to you is that this reading, and then even Imani Peer, which I'm pointing out to you, they offer us an important kind of reminder that artistic expression doesn't have to be kind of this pristine or perfect mode of protest in order to challenge power. This is a musical form that came directly out of and in response to all of the housing and social and economic policies we've been studying, and it is imperfect, and there are lots of things to critique, but there are lots of amazing things to analyze as well. And so I'm encouraging you to do both. So briefly, very briefly, what I want to do is just run you through a couple of the videos I chose for you to watch. Excuse me. And then I will look forward to hearing what you have. So I gave you 4 videos to watch. The first one is Fujila by the Fugees. I hope you all have heard of the Fugees. You definitely probably know Lauryn Hill, Wyclef. I don't know if you know Praz anymore, but some of you are, all of you are different ages in the class, so some of you are going to know the Fugees and have listened to them, and some of you may not. But I'll just tell you this. So the Fugees, they're an interesting pick, and I picked The Score, which I think is actually the only full album they made. They did a lot of singles. But it represents, again, just like DJ Herc, who took his Jamaican background and combined it with his experience in, Black urban space in New York to create hip hop, the Fugees take their kind of transnational Black experiences to articulate life in the streets, and I think some very interesting ways. And so you just are watching this one video. Interesting though, Fujila was like, they made all these different remixes because a big thing about the Fugees was this idea of kind of like transnational or international Blackness, right? So, if you know Wyclef, he's Haitian, but they all grew up in and around Jersey, and they talk about that, and a lot of Caribbean influence, and there's some Rastafarianism mixed in there. I think they did this music video in Jamaica, and they actually took inspiration from a blaxploitation film. But it's again just going to be a song, and think about the ways that you see them depicting and reflecting on Black life in the streets, and think about the fact that they're singing about it in a way that could ring true for New York or New Jersey, where they're speaking often of their experience growing up, as well as where they're filming in a place like, Jamaica and Kingston, right? So it's interesting to think of the connections between Black urban space internationally. If you're not familiar with their name, the Fugees, that they took that because that was kind of a derogatory term that was thrown at Black immigrants at the time who were refugees, right? Just like Wyclef and his family. And so it's, again, they take their name because they're really thinking about the different ways that Blackness exists. And in a space like New York City, you can have a whole lot of Black people who have a whole lot of different experiences in that Blackness of being from Haiti or Jamaica or, Harlem. So it's interesting to think about all of that. So the next thing I gave you to watch is, you're actually watching just hip hop. I think it's called Hip Hop Saved My Life, which is not the best song on this album, but I wanted to give you an actual music video. So if you're not familiar, The Cool by Lupe Fiasco is a phenomenal album, particularly when we're talking about the streets. It's a concept album, and so those figures there, I know the graphics are not that great, But he designed this whole album around these three figures called the game, the streets, and what was the other one? Blanking out. Hold on. The streets, the game, and I can't remember because that's just where I'm at this week. I apologize. But it's a great album because he goes through, and you can see the cover image there. There's a symbol for each one of them, and he uses these figures, these characters, to really work through all the different ways in which the streets kind of operate, and what that means internally for this. There's like this key. Michael Young History is the main kind of protagonist of the album. And it's really interesting because he died, he was killed, and then he like resurrected. And so, and then he's like in love with the streets and motivated by the game. And it's an interesting thing. But if you're interested in listening to more, probably the best song on here to really get at what we're talking about is called Put You on Game, which is a great song. But in that, Lupe Fiasco really ties the reality of urban blackness in the U.S. to larger kind of colonial issues. So he really makes a case that what was done to black people through U.S. policy in this country was done to black people and throughout Africa and the Caribbean and other places, right? So he makes an argument, the same forces power, but they just play out in different ways. And then he really gets to the ways in which people internalize and are motivated by their desire, again, for power, for validation, to live these lives that lead to kind of drugs and violence and the implications of that. So it's an interesting thing. The video you're watching is more a take on like what hip hop means to people. And, we all know it. A lot of people are like, everybody knows someone who wants to be a hip hop star. So it's an interesting take on that. But I can't wait to hear what you all think of that one. So I'm not going to say much about this because I would almost guarantee that everyone in this class has heard of Kendrick Lamar and is familiar with Be Alright. It's, become an anthem for the Black Lives Matter movement. I gave you this because the music video itself, pay close attention to the imagery there, because he did a lot to really weave in issues of kind of images that tie to questions of like Black life, particularly in racialized urban spaces. So I'd like you to focus on some of the images you see in that one. I will say I picked that song again just because music video, it was the best choice, I think. But really, if you're familiar with Good Kid, Mad City is a really good album for thinking about the streets. That is another concept album where he follows kind of his younger persona, K-Dot, through essentially his life growing up in LA, and you get a lot of even things of like how you navigate the neighborhood and who you know and things like that. It speaks to a lot of what Imani Perry is talking about of like, it's giving voice to this figure who's trying to navigate these things and recognizing what is the product of kind of white supremacy and power, and what is the role of a community and helping a good kid try to navigate these spaces, and then what's just like humanity and trying to live and be happy and be a little silly at times. I think what's unique about that album and Kendrick Lamar's work in general is it really just tries to give us it gives a really interesting depiction of questions of race and space and the streets, and particularly neighborhoods in LA, but on this personal level of like, what does it just mean to be a Black human in these spaces, and how do you express that, right? So I'll leave it at that. I won't dig too much more. I'm trying to keep an eye on time for you. The last thing I assigned was Trouble on Central by Buddy. And I'm not sure, I'd be curious to know how many of you have heard or listened to Buddy. He's one of my favorite artists. But this is a great song. Again, pay attention to the imagery here, and pay attention to the juxtaposition between, again, in these images you can see like the confining and the negative implications of like Central Avenue, and there's some imagery in there of like threats to Black life, right, and the police, but also like the freedom and the joy of hanging out with his friends and riding in the car. And think about the way he tries to express like the, again, like a lot of our literature and films did, the nuanced experience of being Black in these segregated spaces, of recognizing the reality of, confinement and threats to your life, but also the very human desire for love and freedom and hope, and just like very basic things like chilling with your friends and driving down Central, right? So pay attention to that. Those are the 4 videos I gave you, and then for the other posts, you're going to find something that you want to share with us, and so I'm very interested to see what you all come up with. So as you're picking your music video to share with us, the question I really want you to ask yourself is, when you think about the streets, when you think about not just the policies that created kind of, projects and geographic segregation and confine Black people into spaces like South Central LA or, happened in the South Bronx, but when you think about, especially the last few weeks, music videos or songs that show the way that Black people respond to that, whether it's them identifying the role of the government in creating kind of limitations, or whether it's them saying, yeah, I'm sitting here and I'm seeing someone dealing on this corner and this going on, but I'm also living life and finding community and hope, and it's complex. My life is complex and I am complex as a Black person. What comes to mind for you? So find a video or a song that really depicts the streets or Black life in the streets to you, and then tell us why you picked it. Read the post, make sure you post the link. So in your comments, just post a link, and then you all should click the link that your classmates post and react to it. So follow the instructions that way. But yeah, you'll just post a link to it. So good luck. I look forward to seeing what you come up with.